I'm now going to introduce, to some of you introduce, but a lot of us already know him, Pete Ormosi. He's the one of the economics lecturers at the UEA. I was fortunate enough to be taught by him, and from that it spurred my interest in economics. So I'm thrilled to have him here today, and he's going to talk to us about some of the stuff he's been looking into to do with competition. So I'll hand over to Peter.
Okay, well, thank you, Alex. That's great, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to present our research to non-academic audiences, because whenever I go to a conference, it's always this, we're exposed to the people who think like us, and it gets boring. So whenever we get outside of academia, then it becomes more interesting, we get more interesting questions, and so on. And also, don't ever ask an academic to talk about their research, because they will never stop. But anyway, I will use my privilege of being able to talk for an hour. Hopefully you'll find it entertaining enough. But before I start, just to introduce myself, I'm Peter Ormosi. I'm a senior lecturer of competition economics. I will explain in a minute what it means. I have PhDs in law and economics, so I kind of try to do a little bit of both, or actually not a little bit of both, but what I do, as you will see, is a mixture of the two. I've not always been an academic. I've worked in competition enforcement, and I've worked in international, at an international organization, the OECD, before I finally decided to climb up to my ivory tower of academia and sit there probably until retirement. But nevertheless, I still do a lot of non-academic work, consultancies for the European Commission, the World Bank, the OECD. These are recurrent jobs. Again, it's the same sort of thing. It's always nice to have exposure to the outside world, and it's always a reality check for us. What we're doing, does it make sense? Is it useful for non-academic audiences? Beyond the fact, of course, my main target is to get published. But would I get published? Is it something that can make the world a better place, as we'd all like to hope? I also sit on the academic board of the Competition and Markets Authority of the United Kingdom. Again, it's a very interesting and challenging piece of work. Now, I needed to flag this up because this is the reason Alex invited me. Last year, I started doing a YouTube channel called Chopping Board Economics, where I explain economics, simple ideas of economics, through cooking. So I choose a recipe, I present the recipe, I present what I do, and somehow related to that recipe, I explain some concept in economics. Very simplified, of course. It's all within 8, 9, 10 minutes. So it's all, I try to make it quite snappy. Lots of animations to illustrate what I'm doing, and so on. Now, this is not what I'm going to do today, unfortunately, because it doesn't work in a classroom. It works well on video, where actually I have the time to edit things and do the animations that actually make it look good. But this is why Alex, this is brilliant, Peter. Could you do something like this here? Well, I'm not going to start cooking, but instead what I decided to do, to still make it interesting, is just to talk about in general what I do and what people around me, so people I work with, do at UEA. And it's not just a kind of a self-serving presentation. I think there is always a possibility to work with us at UEA. We have contacts with mainly government organizations, but not just, you don't just have to think about global level like the OECD. We have local contacts. We have done work for, in the private sector as well, working together with local businesses, which is why I hope maybe if I give you a little bit of a tour of what we do, we can that could start some interesting conversation. So you've already seen the logo, Centre for Competition Policy. Apart from being part of Norwich Business School, I'm also a member of CCP. CCP is an organisation that was set up in 2002, and since then it has grown to be a world-leading research centre that focuses on competition policy and regulation-related issues. Now, we're not just economists, we have lawyers, so it's a joint venture between the School of Economics, School of Law, MBS, and political science. Currently, we have about 60 members. We don't sit in the brutalist part of UEA. We are lucky enough to have a residence in Earlham Hall. Well, actually, it's one of the annexes of Earlham Hall, so it's a very nice building. Just recently been done up. Now, so it's in our name, competition policy, Centre for Competition Policy. I'm a competition economist, so I think it's probably useful to make sure that we're all on the same page. What is it? What is competition? Why do we care? And I think those of you who have studied economics with me at UEA, you probably know this because we've done this a lot. But nevertheless, just a little bit of a recap. What we care about competition because under market competition we have lower prices, we have greater product variety, we have better product quality, improved innovation and faster innovation, which all together helps productivity growth and improves living standards. Now, if there is some sort of limitation to competition, consumers are made worse off, growth slows down, and eventually, and this is where it actually becomes interesting and quite topical these days, eventually it can have an impact that goes way beyond the boundaries of that particular market that you might be talking about. So we might say, well, we've been seeing I don't know, huge tech companies gaining immense amount of market dominance, and you say, well, okay, well, it's all an IT business, or it's all in internet search engines, or it's all in some sort of relatively small market. Well, actually, what we have been seeing, and I will have a few slides on this, is because concentration is increasing across many markets at the same time, this now has much wider implications than just saying in those particular markets prices going up or innovation slowing down. So these are very important issues beyond, as I say, beyond just the sort of the short-term impacts, and which is why we have always been a successful research centre, academic research centre, and successful outside the academic world. Policymakers are always interested in competition. You look at any government manifesto, competition, you just search for the word competition, will feature many times. It's always a central part of it. What will happen to competition? Even today, when there are increasingly loud voices to somehow limit competition and increase things like state aid and so on and so on, still competition plays an important role. It's there in the debate. And I think in that respect we have been lucky because we've always been consulted and we've always been looked at for advice. So as I said, we're not just academics. At CCP we work for the organizations I've already mentioned, but for the private sector as well. We have a very strong research group looking at regulation, mainly energy, but looking at other utilities as well, which has actually been going on for more than 15 years and have worked together with various consumer organizations small, medium-sized enterprises, utility companies, so working with the private sector. I will just give you two examples of the sort of work we do outside of academia. This first one is something that I did for DG Comp. This is the competition part of the European Commission. And my job was to provide evidence on the innovation impact of two mergers in the hard disk drive market that happened in 2011. Just a little bit of a background. In 2011, hard disk drive market was 5 companies. It was Samsung with a very smaller market share, but they were the big guys are Western Digital, Seagate, Toshiba and Hitachi. In 2011, Western Digital bought Hitachi, the hard disk drive segment of the market, and Seagate bought Samsung's hard disk drive division. So basically the market came down from 5 players to 3 players only, and this is global. So since 2012, there are only 3 companies that make hard disk drives: Western Digital, Seagate, and Toshiba. And it's a fairly concentrated market, so there were concerns at the time: what will happen, will prices go up, and so on. And we have seen that prices haven't actually gone up, but the other thing that people started to show interest in is what happened to innovation. We care about innovation, especially in these markets, which are largely driven by fast innovation. And so we want to make sure that whenever we have such a big change in the market, that won't have a negative impact on innovation. So we were asked to do this study. Very interesting experience, always working with the European Commission. Totally unrealistic expectations. You know, they give you 12 months to do a study that would normally take about 5 years, and then totally under-resourced and so on. But it's still fun, and actually managed to get the work published afterwards in a very good journal. But just to, if I were to summarize, it's a 200-page report, but if I were just to summarize in one slide, this is the figure that I would use. What this one shows is what happened to R&D spending, R&D expenditure at these 3 companies after the merger. So these 2 vertical lines, this is the period of the merger. So a merger never is a sort of a sudden instantaneous event. It takes time to get through the regulatory barriers as well as all the administration that happens with it. So this is the period of the merger, and that's the before and that's the after period. What's interesting here, and that's what you need to look at, is that yes, we can see that after merger, this grey solid line doesn't really come through on this screen, but this is Western Digital, and it's going up. So we kind of say, okay, it's fine, you know, we shouldn't worry. But it was going up beforehand as well. Maybe it kind of became a little bit steeper, but not really much. And actually, when we tested it, there's not a significant difference. Now, why it's important is because we can't really say that anything happened as a result of the merger. The tendency for Western Digital, actually, when you look at the industry news, that they were investing a lot in R&D anyway, and so the merger was really kind of part of, rather than the driver of this increase in innovation. Where we find a big change was actually Seagate, where you can see that kind of overall, I mean, there is this bump here, but it kind of stays at the same level, and after the merger, it starts going up. And we looked at other sources of evidence as well, not just R&D spending. So we looked at things like patent activity, looked at things like unit cost of units, for example, how much does it cost to produce 1 gigabyte of storage, and so on. And And all of these concluded that actually Seagate did benefit from this consolidation in the market. Toshiba, there was always the outsider. They didn't buy anything. Well, actually, they did end up buying a very small segment of Hitachi that Western Digital didn't need. That we didn't find any change for Toshiba. But the important lesson here, and that was our conclusion, and that's what we paid for, is what happened. Well, we could conclude that there was no negative effect. And I was repeatedly asked, okay, why do I think, as an economist, why market has consolidated significantly? Why was there no negative effect? And my story is, having spoken to many people from the industry, engineers who know the technology, is that there was such a huge, and still is, a huge competitive pressure from an alternative product to hard disk drives, and that's a solid state drive. If you have a laptop of this size, this won't have a hard disk drive in it because it's too big. This would have an SSD. It's a different technology. It's much more expensive, although costs are kind of converging over time. Certainly at the time of the merger, SSD was a lot more expensive solution. Yet the threat of having an alternative product is sort of, in my understanding, disciplined the market enough, the hard disk drive market enough, so prices didn't actually increase. Innovation kept going because they knew had they actually become slack with innovation, they probably would have fallen behind innovation in SSD, and they didn't want to do that. So this is sort of one example of what we do in terms of non-academic work. And I actually shouldn't say non-academic work, because actually what we did was very academic. But another example is, as I said, there is a huge branch of CCP that looks at regulation, and mainly energy, and within that, mainly consumers. How are consumers affected by, over 15 years they've been doing this. Over 15 years we've seen a lot in the energy sector, a lot of changes, political changes, market changes. Market was liberalized in the 90s, and at first it looked like it was a great success, and then suddenly the market started consolidating to the big energy companies, and that's sort of that improvement that we saw at the beginning is slowed down, and people have always been questioning, why is that? And the people I work with, their story is that we mustn't forget the demand side of this whole story, of this larger story. By demand side, what we mean is that how consumers behave in this market. And over many surveys, these are really large consumer surveys, my colleagues have found very interesting, and you might have actually seen this communicated in the press as well, but some very interesting findings. So even for savings of £100 to £300 a year of energy bills, still only about a third of the consumers were happy or willing to switch. People just not switching. People, I don't know how representative this room is, but could you just put your hand up if you changed energy supply within the last year or 2 years? Okay, we've got one, and people don't even look around for prices, and most people that were surveyed don't even know who their supplier is. They couldn't say, they were guessing, maybe E.ON, no, and there was some real striking inactivity from consumers. And it's very difficult to implement those reforms to introduce competition in the market if consumers don't react. The only way the benefits of competition can actually be harnessed is that if consumers are responsive. You can have as many businesses as you want, as good products as you want. If consumers are tied in for whatever reason to one business, it is as if they were facing a monopolist, so no other company at all. Interestingly, it's not just consumers, like end consumers, individuals. When CCP work together with small and medium-sized enterprises, we find that not as bad, but still very striking inactivity in trying to get a better deal. And of course, there the bills are much higher than the potential savings were much higher for businesses. And yet, they were not looking, they weren't really interesting, and weren't engaging. There were many, as I say, this has been a long process, and this research had huge impact in terms of how policy has been shaping. Sadly, well, to us, maybe some people would disagree with this, they ignored the many studies that we have produced when they came up with the latest solution to cap energy prices. So CCP's suggestion was that it was never going to work. As soon as you cap prices, what you do, you punish the active consumers. And this actually already started happening. Energy companies are getting rid of the best offers. Instead, actually, everything is leveling out. Whereas at least these consumers who were willing to switch got a really good deal. Now, their ideas of what they can make out of this are disappearing as a result of the price cap. What they were suggesting to do was more of an opt-out solution rather than opt-in. There's a huge amount of behavioral economics literature whether opt-in or opt-out works better in a setting like this. And based on this, CCP was arguing that what should happen is an automatic switch to the cheapest supplier, and people can opt out if they want. Anyway, it didn't happen. Still influenced policy debate. It was mentioned a lot in Westminster, but was ignored eventually. Okay, so please do stop me anytime if you have questions. If I don't have time for all my slides, it's not the end of the world. Okay, so just some of my contributions, because I have a chance to talk about this, but I'll try to make it interesting, I promise. I did actually think, oh, what should I talk about that's actually interesting to a non-academic audience? So a lot of my research that I actually do, academic research, is methodological. I like to think about different ways of estimating different impacts. I love data, I love statistics, I work with data. Currently I'm studying computer science to be even better with data and machine learning and artificial intelligence, how I can use it in my research. Very dry and abstract. Of course, once we have these methodological advances that I'm trying to work on, it's great because then you can apply it, and that's when it becomes interesting to the non-academic world. But I'll try to make it. And do tell me if you find it boring, and I'll just move on. Okay. So we're often asked in what I do. Actually, sorry. Let me just take a step back. A lot of the work I do for policymakers is estimating the impact of something. So there were these two mergers. What was the impact on innovation? There is a change in the law. What was the impact on prices? And so on. So it's a fairly standard sort of, it's called policy evaluation type work. And I think the key word here is standard. There is a set methodology for that. This is how you do it. And this is how it's accepted. Even things like often I get requests to provide estimates of how price fixing collusions were affecting consumers, how they harmed them. It's called damage estimate. Then it goes to court. Now these are methods that even courts accept. These methods have been around for so long that there is this understanding. Okay, we can really believe these and what the results we get from these. The problem is the answers that we can get from these are limited. And I've always had a feeling that that we were in this joke. I don't know if you know this joke, that somebody loses their wallet and then bumps into a policeman, and the policeman says, "Oh, sir, is this where you lost your wallet?" This bloke searching for his wallet under the street light. And I said, "No, I lost it in the park, but this is where the light is." And I always felt that this is what we're actually doing. Well, we have these very important questions in the dark here, but of course we don't have light there, so it's a lot harder to search. And of course, as an academic, that's what I find challenging. Okay, can we find a way to turn on the street light in these dark areas? So parts of this darkness that I focused on are these questions. So let me give you a little bit of background what I mean by these. So because of my legal and economics background, I've always been interested in the deterrent effect of the law, and especially the deterrent effect on businesses. So if you have some sort of legislation, for example, any sort of criminal sanctions you introduce in response to fraud, does it deter businesses from doing fraud? If price fixing is illegal, I will tell you in a second what is price fixing. We make it illegal. We have an institutional framework that goes and enforces this law, and people are we put resources in this framework to police markets, to find businesses who might be fixing prices. Does it deter? And that's not it's an obvious question, but it's not an easy question to answer. And the reason is because deterrence happens in the dark here. It's very hard to tell. Deterrence means that there is a business, they could do this, but they decide not to. Okay, what's the evidence that this thought process took place? Of course, you'd like to know, because I like to believe the most important function of the law is to deter. I mean, just think of it. We don't want to live in a society where we say, well, anyone can steal, we just make sure everyone gets punished. No, we won't. Then that's why we have criminal law in place, so that people don't steal. And yes, of course, it's also the morals as well, and most people wouldn't steal even if there was no criminal law. But still, we are interested in how much is deterred. It's a very important thing, a lot more than, okay, what was the price impact of this and that and that. So these important questions, how do we answer them? And there have been, I'm not the only one doing this, there have been attempts to do it. I will show you a few of my attempts, and hopefully it will be interesting. But before that, because a lot of these are focusing on cartels, and we don't mean cartels as the Mexican drug cartels, but it is cartels in the economic meaning, price fixing behavior by businesses, bid rigging, and so on. As I said, if you came to my lectures, you probably know this. I think it's a very important thing that everyone knows what cartels are, because very often, as I said, I used to work in enforcement. We often find that, especially smaller businesses, when we caught them engaging in price fixing, we find that they didn't even know it was illegal. So what is price fixing? Price fixing is it's when businesses agree what price to charge. Why do they need to agree? Well, it typically happens in markets that are more concentrated. So I'm not going to give you like the big examples like HDD, small examples, cases that actually I have seen happen. A small town only has 3 gyms, and the 3 managers of the 3 gyms coming together and say, okay, you know what, why don't we actually set the price at this level? It kind of all makes sense. Why compete? Of course, the price we end up with is much higher than what the competitive price would have been. And in these competitive prices, even without talking to each other, it is possible that prices would be higher. Now, the reason businesses do end up talking to each other is because it's easier to enforce this. If you say, okay, we've got an agreement, and especially if we talk about a small place, a small town, people know each other. In a small market, even the HDD world, we only have 3 companies. It's very easy to talk to each other and to actually monitor what the others are doing. So it's tempting, and it happens a lot. And so when it becomes formal, when this collusion becomes formal, that's what we call a cartel. It doesn't just have to be on prices, it could be anything else. I've always been obsessed by this. We have horses, and every time we call a vet, it's always if she's not available, we can't call another one. Because if we do try, they always say, no, that's not my area. I said, what do you mean that's not your area? We pay. And I've always been obsessed. That is a typical example of a market allocation cartel, when businesses say, I'm only serving this area, you're only serving this area, and we're not competing because we split the market. So if you ever have to deal with vets, I didn't say anything. It's my suspicion, and it might not be true. It might be some sort of professional agreement that makes it. But that's an example, and that's another sort of way of colluding, and that's another type of cartel. Okay, so we got these cartels, and we observe some of these because we have these agencies, like in the UK, there's the Competition and Markets Authority that looks at the markets all the time, monitors markets, awaits from phone calls from businesses who might find something suspicious, and detects cartels. Now, at the European level, it's all done by the European Commission. In 2016, 6 cartels were detected at EU level. It doesn't mean that there were only 6 cartels in the EU, but those cartels they don't go beyond the borders of any member state. They stay within or they stay under the authority of that country's competition agency. So if it's only UK, for example, it's the CMA who would look at it and not the European Commission. So the European Commission found 6 cartels, and they estimated that the consumer benefit from detecting these cartels and busting them and getting rid of them was something between 7 and 10 billion euros. So it's basically they tried to estimate if they had carried on, how long they would have carried on for, what was their overcharge, so how much higher the price they were charging in comparison to the assumed competitive price. And from there, these are really back of the envelope calculations. We worked with DG Comp and with the CMA on how to do this quickly, because here the job is they have to do this quickly. So, for example, in the UK, the CMA has to provide estimates every year to the Treasury that for every £1 spent on the CMA, there is at least £10 consumer savings from busting cartels, overviewing merger activity, advocating our policymakers, and so on. So they have to do it quickly. These are very simplified estimates, so I wouldn't read a lot into it, but it kind of gives you an idea of the magnitude of how harmful cartels are.
So, did you say that this has to be contained within the EU to be counted within this?
No, these
are.
So the only thing that matters when it's EU level is that they are active in the EU. So it could be 2 American companies. If they do business, if they have any trade in the EU, then it would come up and the EU would investigate it. So these cartels very often do also get investigated by the Americans, Australia, so basically everything, and especially an increasingly dominant international competition authority or on the international scene. The Chinese competition authority, they are also now looking at some of these cases. So the question is it only a tip of the iceberg? And if it is, how large is the part of the iceberg that we don't see? How do we know and how could we estimate how many cartels are out there altogether? So what I proposed here was introducing a method that at the time hadn't been applied in economics. It's a method that's actually frequently used in ecology, things like epidemiology or biology, to estimate population parameters of various species.